Welcome to episode 8 of the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. I'm your host, Doug Stevenson. In this episode, I want to share my take on what's now being referred to as an origin story. I mean, oh my gosh, so much talk about origin stories. Now, movies have used origin stories for decades to explain how a superhero got their powers, like the backstory of a hero like Spider-Man. How did he come by his superpowers? Or the opening scenes of Wonder Woman, where she's a young girl learning to become a warrior. In the context of the kind of stories that we're talking about here, an origin story answers a number of questions, like who are you? How'd you get here? What obstacles have you overcome? Who influenced you along the way? And what motivates you to do what you do now? It's basically your life story in 4 to 6 minutes, which poses a challenge, right? How do you explain to someone in 4 to 6 minutes who you are and why you do what you do? And more importantly, why should they care? Why should the people listening to you care about your origin story? In any case, it's basically your backstory, the prequel, who you are now as a result of the life that you've lived. Now, the origin story you choose to develop and tell depends on who you're telling it to. Is this your story or the story of your company? Are you telling it in a job interview in front of a room full of angel investors, in an important speech to your team or your company? And like any story, you need to know what you want people to do with this information, what you want them to know. So you got to start with the end in mind. Be strategic. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, please click on the subscribe or follow button. All right, you ready to go? Let's get started. Here's an example of an origin story for a company. In 1995, Larry Page and Sergey Brin met at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. They were both computer geeks, and in 1996, they decided to collaborate on a research project to analyze the relationship among the backlinks on websites. You know, the hidden code in the background, and they called their project Backrub. Well, their goal was to organize all of the information in the world and make it universally accessible and useful so anyone could access it. You and me and anyone, anywhere, with a few simple search words. This was a university project, and their test cases for the functionality were other Stanford University students who needed access to information without having to go to the school library all the time. Well, it became so popular that it very quickly got up to 10,000 searches a day. Well, a year later, in 1997, they bought the domain name google.com. And they set out to find some investment capital, some angel investors, because they knew they were onto something that could be very, very big. So they asked around. And in August of 1998, they were able to get a meeting with a Stanford alum named Andy Bechtolsheim, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems. Well, they could have sat down with him and talked about code and backlinks and how the search engine worked. And there may have been some of that, but I believe they told him a story. They painted a picture of a future scenario where anyone could sit down at any computer anywhere with a few keystrokes and have access to all of the world's information. And the technology that they would use to do that was called a Google search. Well, Andy got it. He caught the vision. And Larry and Sergey walked out of his meeting with a check for $100,000. Pretty nice, huh? Well, 1 month later, in September of 1998, they incorporated the company. It was based in a garage of a friend in Menlo Park, California. I swear to you, if I owned a garage in Menlo Park, I'd be rich right now. That's an origin story of a company, an angel investor kind of story. And it had just enough backstory to help someone understand not only what this new concept is, but why they should care and get involved. So I've come up with a simple formula for developing your origin story. And it goes like this: 3 parts: the spark, the journey, and the resolution. The spark is that moment when you have a revelation, you see something or you witness something or participate in something, and something clicks, something changes for you. And all of a sudden, in that moment, you make a decision to move in a direction you hadn't planned on, to do something you weren't planning on doing. It could be a decision about a career path or a life choice, or about wanting to have 6 children or be a vegetarian or live 3 months in Paris. But the spark is where your origin story begins. And that in and of itself is a huge challenge, because which spark do you choose? The career direction spark or the life direction spark? Well, it depends, doesn't it, on who you're going to tell the story to. Now, there are a bunch of possible sparks in my life, because I've thought about this too. It's like, where do I start? Which spark? Do I start with my dad, Jerry Stevenson, who was always at the front of the room, leading the meetings, being the president of every organization, being the Cub Scout leader, the Boy Scout leader, being the speaker, telling stories, the guy who everyone looked up to? Was he the spark that influenced me to be the center of attention, the guy at the front of the room, the speaker, the storyteller? Or do I choose my first acting teacher in Chicago when I was 19, Ted Liss, the man who taught me how to be an actor, but he also taught me how to coach other people? Or do I go back even further to when I was 13 and I saw a movie that changed my life and made me want to be an actor? Which spark? Which spark do I choose? So I want to ask you this. Think about the sparks in your life, the people and the events that influenced the person that you are today. What did you see that set you off in a new direction, that changed everything for you? Who did you witness? Who did you see that became a role model for who you wanted to be, or what kind of a person you wanted to be, where you wanted to go in life? Now, based on the spark you choose, the next step is the journey. And this has to be carefully chosen, because the journey is a lot. It's everything that happened to you as a result of the spark, after the spark. And you have to narrow it down to 1 or 2 moments or events that illustrate what you did over time. Which actions did you take? What decisions did you make? And how did they work out? And you got to include in this journey some of the obstacles you encountered along the way, the mistakes, failures, and small disasters that proved that you were serious, that you persevered, that you didn't give up just because there were setbacks along the way. And then finally, there's the resolution, the happy ending, the finish line. Every origin story starts somewhere, moves forward, and ends up in the here and now. The resolution is also the place where you make the connection to the people listening to your story. How does your story relate to them, to what's going on with them in that moment when you're speaking to them? How is your story relevant to their current situation? Now, I've been a guest on lots of other podcasts, specifically storytelling podcasts, and they all asked me to share how I developed my story theater method, and if my acting background had anything to do with it. And here's what I tell them. This is my story theater method origin story. Now, if you remember in episode 6, I told you my streaking story. What I didn't tell you was that prior to that experience, my friends had been encouraging me to try stand-up comedy because I was funny. Everybody thought I was funny, and I knew I was funny, but I never knew what I'd talk about in a stand-up comedy routine. I didn't feel like I had any material. But after getting arrested naked, I felt like I finally had something, a funny story that I could use as a stand-up comedy routine. So I signed up for an open mic night at a comedy club. And when it was my turn, I stepped up to the mic and I told my story about going streaking and getting arrested naked. And nobody laughed. I bombed. So I thought, oh man, I need a better audience. So I went to another comedy club and another comedy club, and I kept telling the story the same way every time, and nobody laughed. I was demoralized. I couldn't figure out what was missing to make the story as funny as it was when I told it at a party or at someone's house. Fast forward 17 years. I'd left Hollywood, demoralized, a failure, and relocated to Colorado Springs, Colorado, where I got a real estate license and started selling houses. Well, one morning, I was at a networking breakfast and they had a speaker and he was terrible. And week after week, every speaker was boring or terrible. And I thought, heck, I could do better than these people. So I convinced someone to give me a speaking slot. And I put something together. I have no idea what, and it went pretty good. People liked it. And so I did a couple more speeches around town because I kind of liked it. And then I went to a real estate conference where there was a professional speaker, the first one I'd ever seen. And this guy was good. He was funny and smart. And I knew because he wasn't talking about real estate, that he was getting paid to do that, to give that speech. And that was it, the spark. You could get paid to give speeches. And I knew right then and there, that's what I wanted to do. Because by the time I'd started to find myself as a speaker, to find my speaking persona, if you will, my style, my humor, my rhythm, I was having fun at the front of the room. Well, I started teaching presentation skills. That's what everybody seems to do when they start speaking for a living, start teaching presentation skills. And one night I was speaking at the Pikes Peak Library in front of about 40 people. This is a free speech. And without even thinking about it, I said, hey, you guys, you want to hear a funny Hollywood story? And they all nodded. And I started telling the streaking story. And for some reason, I was really in a zone and feeling good or something. And instead of just standing still and telling the story, I started acting it out, using the whole width of the room, my whole body moving around, not just describing running down the street naked, but doing it, running and waving my arms and yelling, "Here I come," at the top of my lungs. And when I got arrested while I was telling the story naked with a crowd of people gathered around and applauding, I didn't describe my embarrassment. I showed it. I was embarrassed. It's like I was there at the end of the alley. And as I was performing the story, because that's what it was a performance, people were laughing so hard, tears were streaming down their faces. I mean, that room was loud with laughter. And as I was driving home, exhausted, but very happy, I was thinking to myself, what just happened? I told that story in comedy clubs and it bombed. What did I do tonight that I'd never done before? Oh, okay. I didn't just tell it. I acted it out. I added the physical and vocal dimensions to the story. I moved all over the place. I used my entire body, the emotions that I felt when it happened. I didn't just describe going streaking. I went streaking and I got arrested naked, and my audience got to be there. They were there in Westwood watching me streak past them in the movie theater line naked. They didn't just watch and listen. They participated. I brought all of that into the room and they loved it. It worked. Well, years later, I performed the streaking story as a showcase for my National Speakers Association group in Denver, and the professional speakers in the room were intrigued. They'd never seen this form of storytelling before, at least that's what they told me. And they asked me to teach them how to do it, how to add the acting element to their stories. So in 1996, I did my first story theater workshop. And these workshops became so popular, they just kept filling up, that they started to take the place of my keynote speaking business. And I discovered something during the transition from being a keynote speaker on change to being a full-time storytelling speaker, trainer, and coach. I discovered that I enjoyed coaching other people on their stories more than performing my own stories and keynotes. Which brings us to the here and now, the resolution of my story theater origin story. I don't do keynotes anymore. I'm a full-time keynote and story coach. I love helping you and everyone else work on their stories, their speeches. So there you have it. The origin story of my story theater method and how I stumbled upon a form of storytelling that changed my life and the lives of you and everyone that I've had the honor of teaching and coaching over the years, hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world. It's been amazing. So remember these three elements to develop your origin story: the spark, the journey, and the resolution. Now, if you'd like help developing your origin story or any other story, feel free to contact my office to schedule a time for us to talk. Whether it's for a speech or a TED Talk or a story that you're going to tell at a networking breakfast, whatever it is, I'd love to meet with you, talk with you, and see if we're a good fit for coaching. And if you just feel like dropping me a line in an email and letting me know what you think of this podcast and what you'd like to learn more about, send an email to me, okay? Doug@dougstevenson.com. 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 I'd love to hear from you. Now, once again, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, there are two things I'd like you to do. First, click on the subscribe or follow button. And second, share this podcast with 3 people. Tell other people about it. Help me spread the word about storytelling that sticks for business and life. All right, you got it? Thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.